And what would it take for the Russian system to sort of truly break with regards to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that's again the thing is the ability to predict when places fall apart has not been terribly good, but we have lots of cases where they did. So, you know, ultimate Ukrainian victory, if you're talking about actually taking back all of the territory, requires Russian loss and realizing they lost, like Putin falling or a new system having to come in. So I think that's something that the West should think about, should try to push. And, we talked earlier about in the early days when the United States tried to play like Russia and we did psychological warfare and political warfare and we tried to overthrow countries and we tried to like dump money into political parties in other countries. And we sort of lost that ability and don't do that much anymore. I mean, this is almost the time to do that. I mean, the
Mm,
president of the United States almost ought to sit down with Vladimir Putin and say, I'm going to make it my mission. If you don't pull out of Ukraine, I'm going to make it my mission to destroy you politically, to make sure you're out of power. Because everything you want is to stay in power, in control. I'm going to waste money. I'm going to find ways to support any Russian political opposition. We're going to dump information into your country. We're going to dump money into your country to people to try to overthrow you. We're going to use every, bit that we can, either secretly or overtly, to do that. And, one of the things, if you grow up in a security service and you use the security services as your main weapon, you tend to think that places like CIA in the West do the same thing and can do the same thing. And
mm.
I think that kind of threat would be something that he would probably understand more. So yeah, Ukraine winning, I think Ukraine in some ways is winning. I mean, there's still a democratic, sovereign country that's willing to fight for itself. Taking back stuff is going to depend on a clear Russian loss and a loss for Putin. I mean, I lived in Finland too and worked in Finland, and I can remember in the early '90s and the late '80s talking to the Baltic people before that, when they were still part of the Soviet Union, saying, the problem is when push came to shove, we didn't fight against Stalin when they tried to in Lenin when they tried to take over our countries, but the Finns killed so many Russians. They fought they lost a lot of land, but they maintained their sovereignty and their democratic way of life, and we didn't. And we learned from that. And so, I mean, I think Ukraine is doing that now. I mean, history books in Ukraine 30 years now will talk about the people who sacrificed for their independence.
If Russia remains sort of under security service rule, is containment the only realistic strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the realistic strategy is not buying the lies and is pushing back against it. To a certain extent, because essentially, if you actually care about Russia's future, this is not, Putin is not the way to go. But of course, there's going to be people that aren't as aggressive on this as me that are going to say,
Mm.
hey, again, if you try to interfere in Russia, you could create a separate set of problems. So I do think the West, probably the most sensible thing is to re-strengthen our alliances, refocus on, maybe, like you said, old-fashioned sort of deterrence, keep them at bay while you focus on other things. Because again, in the larger picture, at the end of the day, China's a much bigger challenge for the West over a longer period of time. Russia's an irritant, a problem. Just they continue to try to do bad things, but it's also, at the end of the day, an economy the size of Portugal, and it's not necessarily a long-term real threat to the
Mm,
West.
indeed. Yeah.
It's a threat to it is a threat to the West, but it's not something we shouldn't be able to handle.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think a post Putin Russia could ever be less adversarial, or are we now facing a generational struggle no matter who is in charge? Possibly because of what I call Putinism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, the the likelihood is, people around, if he sort of dies, the people around, or it might be falling, it's the people around him that understand where the levels of power are and where the money is, and sort of would pull in behind him and try to take the reins. And so Putinism in some fashion would probably continue. And Russia's history is not something that gives us a lot of happiness about what might be happening. They've had czars and they've had Bolshevik commissars, and now they have Putin. And it's always been an autocracy. It's always been repressive. It's always had secret police. It's always treated its neighbors, poorly. It's always treated its citizens poorly. I'd like to think the educated Russian populace at some point would not put up with it, and there is a much better future for Russia. I think we shouldn't write off Russia, but it's not it's not a slam dunk for sure.
No, no, indeed. And what do you think the biggest mistake Western leaders could make with regards to Russia in the next decade?
Is continuing to sort of fall for this. Like even today in the paper, there's talk about uh, Europe using Russian money to support Ukraine, using Russian money, Russian banks. And Putin talked about if they do, there'll be terrible retaliation, and we have nuclear weapons, and on and on. It's the same bluster and the same
Mm,
sort of bully stuff that has gone on and on and on. And he rarely follows through with these things because they win. We tend to back down before we even realize that, hey, in this situation, we're in a more powerful position. So, I mean, one quote unquote good thing to come from this is, prior really to the 2022 invasion, and certainly prior to 2014, there was always this view that, you know, we should just like give in some to Putin. We should deal with him. It's going to come around. There are bigger problems. Um, let's if Putin says he wants the thing and he pushes back, we'll sort of accommodate that. I think now there is at least an agreement and understanding among Western leaders that Putin's Putin. He's an enemy. He sees us as an enemy. He's at a nonstop war with us. Um, this notion that we should just negotiate with him and give in to his demands, I think that's over. So I think in some ways, if Putin stays in power, the West is better prepared to deal with that.
yeah. Well, one random question. If you were in a position of, well, not necessarily
Oh,
authority,
oh.
but advisorship, what would you do? What would you recommend that maybe the president should do about Russia at the moment?
I think double down on Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting them. Ukraine is where Putin is weakest. It's he's got his foot caught in a trap, and we shouldn't open the trap and let him out of it. I think we shouldn't be afraid of Putin falling. I think Western politicians,
Mm,
American politicians
mm,
over the years are so afraid that it's almost all about stability. The situation we have, we understand it. Let's keep it that way. We're afraid to sort of like to rattle the cage for fear it might be worse. But in this case, what's going to be worse than the way Vladimir Putin has treated the West and his own people, for that matter? And so I'm sort of the double down school. Help the Ukrainians. Putin has made a terrible mistake. Now's the time to take advantage of that mistake.